So here comes the SAM. So you put the SAM at the 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock position, one of those positions on either side. And then when you determine that you are going to make your move, you turn through the nose of the SAM. And hopefully you've turned so that the SAM with those little tiny fins can't turn as fast as you can, and it's going to whiz on by you on the other side. If you turn too early, it'll just turn right with you. So, if you turn too late, it's got you. So it's a matter of, in the daytime, you see it at depth perception, you say, okay, I know how close it is. I know it's time to turn now. And so you turn right through the nose of it, and hopefully it goes by underneath it. That's the tactic, and it works great. At night, all you got is that black dot. So you're just working on how bright it is. And, it's our skipper used to say, well, you got to wait till it's about so bright that you can kind of read your kneeboard cards in the cockpit. Oh, okay. Well, is that when you turn, skipper? And you go, well, no, you got to wait a little longer. Well, is that when you turn? He says, no, then you count a couple of potatoes. And is that when you turn? He says, yeah, that's when you turn. It's one of those things. He was an old hand. I mean, he'd been on, this was his fourth cruise. So to us, guy, with eyes this big, trying to figure that out but you can do it. I mean, it's not rocket science, but we didn't lose any airplanes to SAMs, fortunately, at night. So.
Stan, welcome to 10% True. It's great to see you on the channel.
Great to be here.
Stan, you're here as a Vietnam vet, but also somebody who served in the Navy, as we can tell from the picture behind you, through the course of the 1990s. And you have a very, very interesting career that I'm looking forward to unpacking with you. We're going to start with the A-6 experience. You had 130 or so combat missions flying the A-6 in Vietnam. I'm really excited to talk to you about that. So we're going to get into that in just a minute. Before we do, I just want to say to the audience, as always, if you are enjoying this podcast, if you think Stan's story is worth sharing, then please do share it widely with your network. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and make sure that this goes out to as many people as possible. So Stan, we talked before I hit record about my informality in me calling you Stan. You are, of course, a retired Rear Admiral. Do you want to introduce yourself to the audience quickly and tell us who you are, and maybe just go straight into how you ended up flying in naval aviation?
Yeah. I'd be happy to. I'm a Naval Academy graduate, and right out of the academy, I went into flight training and ended up in the A196 flying A6s. I wanted A6s out of flight training and got them. And so I feel very fortunate that happened. I didn't get in my first try at the Naval Academy for political reasons, really. I didn't have a political sponsor, but I enlisted in the Navy and got into the Navy program of being recommended by a commanding officer. And there's no politics involved because all he did was look at the results of your college board examinations. So
had you always wanted to fly then? So you and also around this time, is the draft going on? Are you sort of
yes, the draft. In fact, I was drafted my plebe year at the Naval Academy. I got my draft notice. You know how that works. It just went in the trash. Well, actually, I gave it to my company commander, I guess, and he took care of it. But yes, Vietnam certainly was in full swing. I was entered the academy in 1965. So I didn't go to the Naval Academy to avoid the draft, really. It just seemed like my family's all Navy. My dad was the chief, and my cousin and brother went to the academy, and we're just an all Navy family, and so I thought that might be a good way to go. So I spent a year enlisted, and then 4 years at the academy, and then was commissioned ensign in 1969. And went right into flight training. And I just need to qualify. You know this. I'm a naval flight officer, which means I wasn't at the controls of the A-6. I sat in the right seat. We sat side by side, which is the beautiful thing about the A-6, really, from a crew standpoint. But as a naval flight officer, if you're the senior man in the airplane, you're the mission commander. So there were opportunities for leadership very early in my career, and I just had a lot of luck with being in the NFL program just about the time that they opened it up for command for naval flight officers, up to just shortly before I got into the program. They weren't eligible for command at sea. And so I got in there right at the right time on the ground floor of that, and had great fun, great luck, a lot of flight hours in the A-6, and took it sort of from its beginnings, not really the beginning of the A-6, but it is the beginning of the aircraft system onto the advanced system that it was when we retired in 1997.
Okay.
So I had my career was the combat crews in Vietnam, and then I did as a flight instructor, and then went right back to A6s and VA-65 for 3 cruises, and then Armed Forces Staff College, Air Wing Operations Officer, command of a squadron, command of an amphibious ship, and then command of a carrier. And then as a flag officer, I did a tour as the commander of our forces in Iceland, which was interesting. And then a carrier group command and a staff tour on what was then Syncline Fleet. And then I ended my career as a deputy commander of our Naval Forces Europe in London.
That's quite a storied career.
Yeah.
I know you're probably going to rebuke me and tell me it's not correct, but I'm going to say it anyway. I've never spoken to somebody who's driven an aircraft carrier before. So
Really?
So I'm looking forward to talking to you about that. So let's go back then. Let's go right back then to, you just mentioned that your family were all Navy. Your dad was a chief, so he was enlisted, if I'm correct, and naval stuff is.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Did you World War II? So did you grow up wanting to be in the Navy or wanting to be a naval aviator? What were your passions?
I didn't. Interestingly enough, my brother had that burning desire, and I just looked at it as an opportunity, and to see what I would do when I got there, as a good opportunity, by the way. And Vietnam was going on, and I guess I kind of felt the pull to do something, and quite frankly, rather than be drafted. And so I thought the Naval Academy, I didn't know how long Vietnam was going to last, and I thought the Naval Academy would be a good way to get a great education, serve my country. And I was interested in flying. It always attracted me. So put the 3 of them together, and it just became something that looked like I might want to do. So it worked out for me on my second try.
Did your father then, or can you tell us whether your father counseled you against it or whether he was for it? I mean,
no, he was all for it. He was 100% in. He enjoyed his time in the Navy. Well, I mean, he was at war, but he loved the Navy. He would have stayed in for a couple things, but he made chief and was very, very, very proud of his naval service, and was proud that I wanted to go into the naval service as some other family members had. So I had a couple cousins. My mother had a couple cousins that were Navy Cross submariner types that I had met. So they kind of fostered that aura of the Navy being a good place to be and a great adventure. And it certainly turned out to be one for me.
Can you describe a little about the flying training then from a naval flight officer point of view? So one of the things that comes up regularly, I say it, my readers or my listeners rather will have heard me say it before, which is just the fact that especially in those days, flying aeroplanes or fast jets, if we can call an A-6 a fast jet, was a very dangerous occupation, particularly so then. It still is now, but particularly so then. What was the pipeline like for you then going through NFO training? Did you, and again, I ask this because, some of my guests just say, no, it never crossed my mind. Some of my guests say, yes, it was on my mind. But did you think about your own mortality when you were going through that process? Were you witness to training accidents? How was it?
No, I wasn't witness to any training accidents, fortunately. And interesting enough, when I went back after Vietnam, when I went back to training command to VT-10, where I started my training, we had a couple accidents and lost some people. But I, at that age, I didn't have a real, I guess you'd call it a real fear of death. My mortality didn't enter into my thinking much. It looked like a great adventure. And frankly, not to get out of the war, but I wanted to go to the East Coast because that's where I grew up, Michigan and, Virginia. And, well, not Virginia yet, but I was interested in going to the East Coast, and those slots were all taken by other guys in my class. And so I ended up going to the West Coast. I guess when I went to the West Coast and started training to go to Vietnam, not all the East Coast carriers were going to Vietnam at that time. And so I did start thinking about my mortality a little bit because we trained, I'm sure they did a similar thing on the West Coast, but we trained to go into combat. We trained low-level routes and predicting what the radar was going to look like so we could find the target. And we had a Nike missile site that was set up that overlooked Spokane, Washington, where we could motor towards Spokane. And there was a tone that came out of the radar, or out of the airplane, when we could set it up to broadcast what we call a bomb tone. And as soon as that bomb tone went off, the Nike radar would plot our position and the fall of the bomb based on ballistics, and they give us a spot. So we got training in picking out buildings in a complex. Of course, that was RAG training. In VT-10, we started out with basic navigation in the C-45, believe it or not, tail dragger. And that was really basic DR and TACAN navigation, nothing fancy. And then after we passed that phase, they put us in the T-39 either in the back doing navigation problems. We had 3 students, and we'd rotate from the back to the front, and another just kind of watching. But you'd do low-level navigation and co-pilot duties in the front, or navigation on the table in the back. So you got a little bit more of the cockpit orientation and flying low levels and, what was involved with that. And then after Pensacola, we went to Glencoe, Georgia, where we flew more T-39 missions, and they were strictly, almost entirely front seat navigation, low level nav, and that sort of stuff. And so that was preparing us to go to the jet pipeline, where we'd be involved in looking outside a cockpit and be involved with visual navigation and that sort of thing. We did also get some flights in the T2 in jet orientation flights, basically in low levels, and spatial orientation, that sort of thing in VT-10. So that was the pipeline until you got your wings and went to the RAG, which for me was VA-128 in Whidbey Island.
Did you have, as you went through this pipeline then, did you start to develop an idea as to what platform or weapon system you wanted to be crewed on when you graduated? Presumably you could have gone helos, you could have gone to heavies, A3s are they called?
Well, yeah, you could have gone, the things are open, A3s, E2s, and jets. And so, I wanted to do carrier aviation. So it was for me, it was either F4s or A6s. So those are my choices. And for whatever reason, I just fancied the bombing attack mission of the A-6. And I mean, it was a Vietnam-related mission of flying low levels and that sort of thing that intrigued me more than being a fighter jock, but air combat, that sort of thing. So,
what were presumably the people in your training establishment, the instructors, were coming back from Vietnam or had experience in Vietnam? What were they telling you about the conflict out there? What were they telling you about what to expect?
Well, fortunately, we had a number of A6 bombardiers. Since it was a NFO training squadron, we had a couple of A6 pilots there too, but that flew the T2 and the T-39. But we had a fairly good cadre of A6 bombardiers that told us exactly what it was like. I mean, that the A6 was a great night fighter, although it flew in the daytime. That that it flew low, and that and they kind of pounded into our head, if you will, that in the A-6 you were an equal participant in the mission, and frankly, you were an equal squadron member. You know, the airplane wasn't going anywhere without you. And the idea, and don't get me wrong, I love my fighter brethren, but there were jokes about, well, I'd rather have the 300 pounds of gas instead of that guy in the back and that sort of thing. I can fight these guys by myself, which isn't true when you got sparrows and things. But there was none of that in the A-6. Nobody ever said I'd rather have 300 pounds of gas rather than my BN, because they couldn't do the mission without us. Period. Dot. Yeah, you could not fly low at night by yourself. Your chances of surviving that, even just flying at 300 to 500 feet without anybody shooting at you, or without any SAM evasion, but flying that low, trying to keep your mind on not killing yourself by flying into the ground, and finding your turn points and finding the target were nearly impossible. I mean, it really was. So it was beat into our heads that you're an equal here. He's not going to the target without you, and you're not going to the target without him. Period. Dot. So that intrigued me too. The absolute importance of the naval flight officer in the A-6 mission. There was no doubt about it. It was either have that guy there or you don't do the mission. So I like that, and it fostered great camaraderie in the ready room, because you were equal. You couldn't do it without each other. So it was really a good atmosphere. It really was.
What was before we get into Vietnam then, and hopefully you're going to be able to give us a good description of the A-6 as it was when you arrived at your operational unit, and as you said earlier in the conversation, you flew it through 1997. So we'll get a good history of the entirety or most of the aeroplane's history from you. But what was your introduction then to the A-6 like in the training pipeline? How were you introduced to the carrier environment? What was it like landing in the right seat on the A-6? Presumably that's where you did your first landing on the boat.
Right.
What was that experience like getting ready to go to an operational squadron?
Well, it was a lot of fun. It was very challenging. You don't know anything. You're a nugget. They call the first tour guys, and you haven't been anywhere or done anything, so everything's brand new. The concept in the A-6 was to always put the nuggets with the more experienced guys. So and that went for the pilots as well. So you had a nugget pilot, you'd put an experienced DN with them, and vice versa. So you always had someone there that really knew what they were doing around the carrier and could help you through decision making and that sort of thing. So I was fortunate to go. My first experience going to the carrier was after I'd been in the RAG for a fair amount of time, 3 months probably, before we went to the carrier. And I was going with a commander. I screwed up with a commander who was going to be XO of a squadron. And so we had a great relationship, and he had a bucket full of knowledge, but he didn't treat me like I wasn't there. He realized that part of even though he wasn't a squadron instructor, he was a student. He was on the way to a squadron. He tried to treat me the way I was going to be treated, hopefully in the squadron, as an equal. But I didn't know a lot. So his Rosie Rollins was his name, great guy, and felt like his part of his duty was to teach me all he could teach me in this process. I mean, he didn't need me to help him get aboard the carrier. I've flown with some JOs that I think were glad to have me there when we were during carrier ops for various reasons later on. But Rosie, he didn't need me to get out the carrier and land, but he treated me as if he did, and it made a huge difference in my training and in my feeling of worth and learning process in carrier. So it was a little scary, but especially when you're flying with a commander, you figure, well, this guy got this far, he must know what he's doing. So there was a good feeling there.
So tell us about the A-6 then. I want to understand if you can give us a summary of its history, its introduction to service. Why did the Navy buy it? Why was it needed? You've described already some of the employment in Vietnam in terms of low-level night attack, and we'll get into that. But what, generally speaking, was the rationale behind the Navy buying and fielding the A-6?
Well, basically, I mean, it was very basic. We couldn't do operations in bad weather in the airplanes that we had before the A-6. When weather covered the troops or the targets or whatever, we were basically shut out of flying. So we needed an all-weather airplane that could see the ground when in or through the clag, we call it, the clouds, and it had to be able to drop precision weapons without ever actually having eyeballs on the target. So that was the whole genesis of it. It didn't have to be supersonic. In fact, the big bulbous nose on there was due to the radar. I mean, you had to have this big radar antenna out there, and you weren't going to put that in, like you could put an X-band radar in the nose of a fighter and go do your thing. You had to have a big, in that day for ACE, it was a rotating radar that could look out and scan the ground and find the target. And then you had to, because you couldn't drop the bombs without some sort of computer aid when you couldn't see it, you needed a computer that would calculate those things. It would calculate the wind and the range of the target, the speed of the airplane, and all of that stuff to enable you to get the bombs as close to the target as you possibly could, and hopefully hit it. So that was the genesis. It was need. We had to have something that could attack the enemy in bad weather, especially with when troops are being attacked and that sort of thing. So because you can run the A6 in if you have a radar beacon, you can see that on the radar and use it as an offset aim point to drop bombs. So you didn't even have to really see the target. If you had something was visible on the radar, you could calculate the distance between that object and the target, plug that into the computer, and then run what we call offset aim point. The aim point, you have the cursors on that target that you could see, and it would drive you to that offset point where the target was and drop on the target. So the other interesting thing that the A6 radar had was, and no one's had it before or since, it was called the moving target indicator. And that would it would measure the Doppler of the returns, and it could tell whether the part of the return was moving or not because of the Doppler shift. And so it would, if there were moving vehicles out there, it would present when you were in that mode. It wouldn't show you the ground return, but it would show you the return. It was kind of like a little puffball of a truck or a tank or whatever was moving. Had to be moving 4 miles an hour, that sort of thing. But so you could, and we did run against truck convoys in not so much in North Vietnam, but in Laos, in the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We did my first cruise. We did a lot of that at night, run up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we could find some trucks, and it had the automatic moving target indicator was a great vehicle to kill trucks, to kill movers. So those things made the A6 absolutely unique, and it was everything that the military was looking for to do ground attack in bad weather, and even hit moving targets. So it really hit the sweet spot of Vietnam and the time in Laos, both not so much in South Vietnam. We did deal with moving targets, but in Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and in North Vietnam, Route Package 6 running the roads looking for convoys at night. And we could bomb a convoy without having to do it under flares. That was That was the huge transformation. Instead of having to drop a flare, then go around and try and find your target under the flare, and then dive down below the flare and hit the target visually, you could do it without any flare aid or anything like that. So it really was amazing how it hit the sweet spot of Vietnam. Moving targets, having to go in low to avoid the surface-to-air missile systems and that sort of thing. It was like it was made for Vietnam. It was amazing, really.
Did you have an INS?
Yes, we had an inertial navigation system. Absolutely, it was absolutely necessary to the system. It wasn't the greatest one in the world, but it could be. We had a way to compensate for the drift in the navigation system, assuming it was a constant drift. You could run with the cursors on anything that was stationary and leave it on there for a couple of minutes, then go back to it, and then if they drifted off the target, you'd put them back on the target, and that would say, oh, okay, I got it. There's some drift, and I got that now. So it would compensate for the drift that way. So it was pretty good. For its day, it was pretty good.
Yeah. And
it really was.
Just sticking with the technicalities for the moment, and then we'll get into the mission set and your experience flying those missions. DIANE, I think, was that the name, the digital integrated?
Yeah, the digital integrated analog navigation system. Yeah.
So what when someone says digital, or when something like that says digital, what are they talking about? I mean, you mentioned before we hit record, we were just sort of chatting, and you mentioned a drum computer. I don't really know what that is, but so can you describe DIANE, the drum computer? What does it mean? Why was it revolutionary?
Well, it was frankly, it was a pretty rudimentary computer. You can imagine it was put in the airplane in the early mid-60s. So, computerization in those days was pretty basic, and it had a drum that ran the system, and it was sensitive enough that when sometimes you had a great system and you'd take a carrier launch and the drum would get jostled and you'd have to start all over again, typing everything in all over again, shut the computer down, start it up again. So there were some drawbacks to it, but on the whole, once you got airborne and got the system, if it was going to run for you that day, it ran pretty well, and there was enough memory and stuff in there to put in. Well, in those days we could only put in a couple of targets. We'd have to because of the memory space. We could put a target and then the next aim point in, and then as soon as we cycled that to that 8-point Bravo, we'd have to type in 8-point Charlie. So there was a lot of work involved in moving the navigation system along, really just due to computer space, because it had to have space to figure out the navigation problem along with the things that you typed in to get you from point A to B to C to the target and back. Yeah. So it was fairly rudimentary. And it was a tad fragile to something as dynamic as a catapult shot. So it had its issues, but when it was working, it was a great system. It really worked well.
Did you have radar warning receiver gear on the airplane?
Yes, we had.
1971. Is that when you first went to combat? Was it 71?
I was first in combat, in 71, yeah.
Okay.
And we had RHAW gear. We had both active and passive RHAW gear, that RHAW, radar homing and warning RHAW gear, that would tell us that we were being painted by a number of different radars. And then we had a radar, part of the RHAW gear was supposed to move the SAMs or the radars, lock on you along the side of the airplane until left the tail of the airplane. So it was to move it off of you. So we had those two things, and they worked fairly well. They weren't the most reliable pieces of gear as far as flights without needing maintenance on them. So we were there. It was in the early days of RHAW gear, but we did have it, and it was helpful when especially when we were being painted by a SAM system or any aircraft system, to know what it was and where it was. So it was helpful. We give us a strobe, and we could see it was a search radar or a fire control radar, and then we had audible tones that were particularly helpful in SAM evasion, because it would tell you whether you've been painted by a search radar, and then whether you returned over to a SAM fire control radar, and then whether it was in the when it would have had a warble. I've ever heard it go deedle deedle deedle, and then when you were it went into a high pitched warble, and you knew that SAM was tracking you, not just in the general vicinity of your airplanes. If you had more than one airplane, if there's an alpha strike of 20 plus airplanes. So it was pretty helpful.
Yeah. Did you also have you mentioned the big bulbous nose with the radar. Did you have TF radar? Did you have a terrain following capability in there?
No.
No. Okay. So
we had
just one
we
radar.
had what we had was we had the ability on the pilot's side. He had a big radar scope in front of him, and it showed him a number of things associated with the radar. It was all it wasn't down below that. In the older A-6s, there was actually a radar, a small radar that was a copy of what I was looking at. Pilots didn't use that much, but you could go into a mode that would show the pilot terrain buildup on his scope, which would help him a little bit understand what was in front of him, and where the low spots were and that sort of thing. But it wasn't terrain following radar, not like the F-111 had.
Can you describe then a little bit, just staying with the technicalities, just for one more question? Can you describe a little bit then the radar that you had, its capabilities? You've already talked about the moving target indicator. You've referenced the fact that if you could see the target on radar, you could, or if there was something stronger that you could use as an offset, you would be able to do that. When I've looked at sort of radar imagery from those older systems, I just see a mess. And I wondered, did you have to do a lot of radar interpretation training? Did you have a mapping mode? What did you?
Well, it had a couple of modes. One was just ground mapping, and it just showed you the terrain, and you could see the bend in the river or the bridge, and that sort of thing. That was for navigation purposes. Then when you got into when you actually found the target on the radar, because you could move the range in and out. So you could, in 50-mile range, if the target was down near the bottom, it was hard to see. But if you ran the scope out, we call it would enlarge in a way, because it's still, it's still the same size scope, but it was a smaller piece of the picture. It would enlarge the target. And then when you pretty sure you had the target, you could put it in another mode, which was just a scan, a horizontal scan mode, where the target was really blown up. And so there you could see the difference between two buildings and that sort of thing. But in order to get there, we were in our radar interpretation, our help. We made predictions of what the target was going to look like, and we would get on a map, and we'd make with white not magic marker, but white pencil. We'd put the radar, what we thought the radar return was going to look like and stuff, and we paint it up black on the back so it would kind of look like a radar scope. And then when we got into the target area, we could look at this prediction and say, oh yeah, I think I'm on the target. That's just right where I predicted it to be, as opposed to just looking at it kind of for the first time and thinking, wow, how do I take what the map told me and transition that, to the radar. So we did spend a lot of time making radar predictions that we were supposed to duplicate what we were going to see on the radar scope, and they were pretty helpful. Well, it was a technique that you had to master. But once you got pretty good at it, your radar predictions got pretty good, and they helped it eventually. Because finding that one building amongst many is difficult, to say the least.
Yeah. How long did it take you to do that then? Presumably you couldn't do that straight out of the RAG. You would needed to have gone on a cruise or started a cruise to get to that point of proficiency.
That was all taught in the RAG. That was all taught before we ever went on cruise. We knew how to do that before we ever got to the squadron. That was a very important part of the squadron training in the A-128. And they had an airplane called the TC-4C, it was a 2-engine Gulfstream that had a complete radar cockpit in the back, a complete A-6 cockpit in the back. You could kind of get to it. There was room in the aisle to get around it, and then there was a pilot's station and a complete functioning Bombardier station. It had an A-6 nose on the front, the radar, everything.
Really?
And so you could sit there in that seat with an instructor in a little jump seat next to you and run your mission at Spokane against the city complex with the Nike radar and get his. Sometimes it was help, sometimes he was hindering you because that was the nature of the game. He might pull a circuit breaker and say, "Oh, gee, you just lost your whatever. Now what are you going to do?" type of thing, which, was realistic. So anyway, he could sit there and instruct one way or the other. Instructor, destruct, I guess we called it. But he was there to grade you on the flight and that sort of thing. And then, of course, you could get your hits from Spokane. You were 100 feet at 6 o'clock or 9 o'clock or 11 o'clock, whatever. But all those predictions were done before those hops. So you went from there to then going over there and actually an A-6 with a pilot who, an instructor pilot, but he couldn't see your radar. And he'd check your predictions and say, okay, they kind of look good to me, but it was up to you to find the target without anybody there to coach you. If you might get in the TC-4C in your initial attempts at finding a target in a complex of buildings.
What did you say it was called? TC-4?
It was a TC-4C, a
TC-4C.
C4, yeah, a Grumman Gulfstream, two-seat.
Wow.
We called it the Drut, which was just the backwards spelling of a turd, because it was no fun. The back of the TIC-4 was, you could spell diesel back there, and you'd get bounced around, and you could get a little queasy back there. It was no fun back there. It was hot, So that was a no fun flight, no doubt about it. But you got great instruction back there. In how to work the system, that's for sure.
Hey everybody, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but if you'd like to support the channel, please do visit 10percenttrue.com and take a look at my store. You can buy polo shirts, t-shirts, stickers, patches, and even my books. And speaking of which, if you're listening to the podcast, this won't make sense, but if you're watching it, then great. The one that's being played in the background at the moment is my new book, F-15E Strike Eagle, Be Afraid of the Dark, Part 1. It's a glorious coffee table book, been professionally laid out and put together, tells the story of the Strike Eagle from 1984 to 2002. I'm taking pre-orders for it now. If you're interested in it, if you're thinking that might make a nice present for somebody, please do go ahead, visit 10percenttrue.com. Place an order. Thank you.
Tell us a bit about then your cruise then and your first combat tour in Vietnam, the workup, what sort of study you were doing around the missions you'd be flying. What was the bit like before you actually flew your first combat mission? Well,
we were trained. We trained in the RAG for the missions we were going to fly, and then I got in the squadron in December. We went on cruise in June, so we had an opportunity to do some more of that stuff with the pilots you were going to fly with. They cruised you up with the guy. In my case, it was Steve Kuntz, my first cruise. And then you went out and trained yourselves to get onto Boardman and drop Mark 76 bombs and various radar modes and that sort of thing. And either full mission or backup radar, manual range line type thing. And And then included in that were some workups at the ship, which were primarily designed to work the ship and the air wing together, not necessarily for your combat training. So there was a lot of some CQ and some carrier qualifications and going off to targets offshore California or off of Hawaii or off the Philippines, and you work up on your way to cruise. So you worked a standard workup plan that included going on and off the ship and then upping the ante on the type of things you do off the ship in terms of single plane, dual plane, multi-plane, large air wing strikes to get yourself familiar with the ship familiar with you, and to enhance your ability to do your mission from the ship, because before then it had primarily been done from the shore. So that was our first introduction to really, getting the system going on the flight deck instead of sitting on the deck at Whidbey Island, that sort of thing. Different environment, the ship's moving. There was the ability to hook up to the ship's navigation system that would help you initialize your inertial in the airplane. You had to get used to that. All kinds of things. And then the things that happened when you launched from the ship and it messed up your computer. You had to either get another alignment or get your computer going again and type all the stuff in that you typed in to go on your mission. So all that was taking place in the workups prior to heading for Vietnam. So,
Stan,
on the way to Vietnam, really all we did was we didn't do a lot of flying. We looked at intel. There was just hours and hours and hours and hours of intel. What Russian ship this was, what Russian airplane this was, how things worked in the Gulf of Tonkin, that sort of thing. Plus, we planned single integrated operational plan missions for the nuclear ordnance we had on board in case the balloon went up. We all had a psyop mission, so we were assigned and we'd fly if the balloon went up, load our nuclear weapon up and launch and go drop it on the appropriate target. So there was a lot to do, but that was the general workup format.
Okay. What was your target?
I don't even remember. I really don't. It was a right near an airfield, but I honestly can't remember what the specific, frankly, I planned at least 6 of them. They're all into Russia. Yeah. Nobody's not fooling anybody there. But I can't remember. I had 2 in Vietnam and then 4 or 5 on the med cruises. So I can't remember what they were, to tell you the truth.
Yeah. So I don't want to get too far down a rabbit warren around psyop, but it is a very interesting topic of conversation. To quickly then, were you on a one-way mission for those flights?
They were all basically one way. Yeah. I mean, there were a few that you might make it back to a friendly airfield if it was going to be there. You didn't know that either because you didn't know where things were going. But yeah, ours was one way, and so there were, here's your place to bail out, and here's your here's the look. If you bail out here, the probable location of friendlies, and that sort of thing. So there wasn't much of a chance of getting your airplane back to where you could land on an airfield and go have a hamburger with friendly forces.
Did the threat, or not the threat, but the realization of imminent combat and the threat that came with that make you treat the psyop piece, at least initially, then as a sort of formality, just get it out the way, get graded on it, pass the tests or whatever it is, and then put it to the back of your mind and now start thinking about
to some extent. I think we all regarded it as something we had to do, and we wanted to do it right, but it didn't, it just wasn't important to us at that time. We weren't thinking about nuclear war. We were thinking about imminent combat we're going into, the live thing.
Mhm.
So we did. You were very astute there. We did just sort of do it, put it on the shelf, and now let's worry about what we got to worry about. So yeah, there was a little bit of that. Yep.
I wanted to ask a little bit about A-6 tactics and the stuff that had gone before. So when we read in the books that I kind of write or other people write, we're always talking about pointy nose fighters. But everyone's always writing about the bar cap stuff and how the Navy F4 did and the Air Force F4s and Red Baron and all that kind of stuff. Nobody talks about the strikers, not really, not from a tactical point of view, and the evolution. Can you tell me about them? What had gone before you in terms of A-6 tactics? What was changing where you were in terms of your tactics? What you were expecting to do? Had things been solidified? Had the lessons already been learned? Were they still being learned? Where were you in your tactical evolution with the airplane?
Yeah, I think we were lucky that we had those had gone before us and learned a lot of lessons about how to run the system, how to evade SAMs, how to plan routes, that sort of thing. I think we were we weren't in my squadron. We weren't learning much new, except when they came up with a weapon that we hadn't seen before. They came up with shoulder-fired SAMs, and they came up with ZSU-23s, and we even saw a few SA-3s near the end of my time in Vietnam. So we were facing new things, but a lot of the lessons, survival and target acquisition, and frankly, survival, escape, resistance, and evasion were well learned. And so we weren't at the forefront of A-6 tactics, and my squadron didn't get involved with the first of the laser pods that a couple of squadrons were experimenting with. So I didn't have any experience there at that time. So yeah, the heroes that had gone before us had taught us well, and that had been sent right back to the RAG and imprinted in our brains, before we got to the squadron, essentially. So I think we were pretty lucky by the heroes that have gone before us, bringing those lessons back to us.
You've referenced already a couple of different mission sets. Then you've talked Alpha Strike. Briefly, you've mentioned Alpha Strike. You talked about the low-level strike at night on moving targets. Can you describe then those mission sets? What is an Alpha Strike? What other missions were you going to be flying? Yeah.
Well, the Alpha Strikes were in North Vietnam. We'd go against heavily defended targets in the daytime, and go in. We'd take 20 to 24 airplanes in, and we in the strike group were probably at least 16 bombers, and then you'd have probably 4 F4s that were basically air defense guys, and then a lot of times there was a section or a division of F4s that were actually bomb droppers, and then you had the vigilante, and we'd send in black suppressors sometimes, not all the time. And then we also would usually have a couple of airplanes that had, we didn't have standard arm missiles at the time, we had Shrike. So my first cruise. Second cruise, my squadron had 3 standard arm airplanes. So we'd have a couple of those with us. So it was a big group of airplanes with a core of about 16 attack airplanes, flak suppressors, MiG cap, and then a Vigi would come in later usually with a fighter escort. Mm-hmm. And so you'd go in at high altitude, 20 to 25,000 feet, and in the daytime, obviously, and you had to be able to see the target. And then you'd roll in 16 airplanes on the same target. It was usually a big. We went after some pretty interesting targets. One was a soccer stadium that was just full of of trucks and supplies and tanks and everything else.
Wow.
And the Air Wing commander called that, it was the Bai Thuong soccer stadium. He said, well, we got an intermission today, gents. We're the halftime show at the Bai Thuong soccer stadium. But we'd go, we went after radio communication stations, large targets, airfields, bridges sometimes, big bridges, that sort of thing, where we needed a lot of bombs to take the target out, make sure that we got a significant number of bombs on the target.
What munitions would you typically carry then? You're talking Mark 82?
Typically, we were carrying, Mark 82 500-pound general purpose bombs, or Mark 83 1,000-pound bombs, depending on the target and what kind of penetration needed and stuff. But most of the time on Alpha Strikes, it was 500 general purpose bombs. The A-6 carried 22 of those, so it's quite a load. It was capable of carrying 30 bombs, but the weight limits on the carrier and the catapult limits meant that we were restricted to 22.
Wow. What did it feel like when you rippled 22 bombs off the airplane?
Well, the airplane goes up, it lightens up considerably, but usually when you did that, you were in a dive and you kind of didn't notice it, because it's sort of like the bombs all came off all at once almost, and then you're starting to pull out of the target, so it wasn't as noticeable. When we dropped, sometimes we drop them at night, and it wasn't terribly noticeable, except the airplane did accelerate. It wasn't like it jumped into the air, and it did accelerate because all that drag came off the airplane. But it wasn't terribly noticeable in terms of, if you dropped, we dropped 4 2,000-pound bombs near the end of the war, and that was noticeable when they came off, because we'd salvo them and they came off all at once, and that was really, when you drop 8,000 pounds, leaves the airplane all at once, it's pretty noticeable.
On that then, just digging in a little bit to the Alpha Strike tactic and the employment of the airplane, having listened to you talk about its ability to pick a target out of a bunch of houses, you could pick one and bomb it. How well did that tactic play to the strengths of the airplane then? If there's 18 or so of you and you're all just dropping...
Yeah, to the strengths of the A-6, it didn't, except for the number of bombs it could carry. Because it turned the airplane into just a visual bomber. It was in those days. Later on, if you get even in a dive, if you get the target on the FLIR and designate it, then you could hit that target with the computer. This is no disparagement toward pilots who are wizards at dropping bombs off a fixed bomb site, but you could really hit that target well with the computer dropping it and having it designated on the FLIR. But in those days, we didn't have that capability, so it turned the airplane into a visual dive bomber. So it didn't play to the strengths of the airplane, except for the payload.
So how did it feel flying those sorts of missions then?
They were no fun, to be honest with you, because it was daytime, and our mantra was, if you can see them, then they can see you. So we usually got a lot of flack and quite a few SAMs. Not so many MiGs in my time in Vietnam, but we did get a few. And again, once again, they could see you. So one couple of MiG guys had the tactic of zooming along on the deck and then just pulling the airplane into the vertical and firing SAMs up into the strike group, ATOLs, heat seekers up in the strike group. So there were a lot of things that the enemy could do when they could see you in the daytime that they couldn't do at night. So I really didn't like Alpha Strikes at all, to tell you the truth. I felt like, compared to flying low levels at night, they were extremely dangerous.
Tell us a little bit about that Sam, that MiG threat, then what? I mean, everyone knows what. I mean, they're behind me. The A6 it doesn't look like it's going to be turning too well with a fighter like a MiG-17 or even a MiG-21. What were your thoughts on the possibility of encountering a MiG? How were you going to protect yourselves if you did find one or get jumped by one?
Yeah, well, I divided it into two categories. One was if you're flying at night or flying in the daytime. And if you're flying in the daytime, normally our daytime flights were alpha strikes where you had big cat. So that kind of took care of that problem. And at night, there weren't any MiGs that come down and mess with us at low level. That's for sure. So they weren't an issue, really. So the only time we worried about MiGs was in the daytime, and then we had the fighter escort. So it took that out of the calculus of having to worry about the A6, having to turn and burn with a MiG, and can I outturn him? What am I going to do if he jumps me? And got to get down on the deck and that sort of thing. We didn't worry about that a lot. What didn't mean that an A6 didn't get jumped occasionally. If they were running a road recce in Route Pack 6 or something and on the way out, but they were kind of few and far between. Well, although we did have some MiG issues with a flight from VA-196 before I got there that got a couple airplanes shot down. We're not sure whether they got shot by MiGs, but I know there were MiGs in the area and they had a problem with them. But generally at night, I didn't worry about it much. You had bar cap up there, drilling holes in the sky, just waiting, salivating for a MiG call. And we felt like they'd get there in a heartbeat and they'd take care of the problem. But I never encountered a MiG at night. So, and not many in the daytime, really, that the Air Force didn't take care of, chase off.
So one of the things that I think about when I hear you describe 60-degree dive in the A6, dropping your bombs on these targets in a mass formation, is I think about the accounts of F-105 pilots in the Air Force about doing the same thing. And what they talk about is when they pull out of the dive, they go into afterburner south, and then they're doing 600 knots, 550 knots, 600 knots on the deck. They're supersonic. They're getting the hell out of there really quickly. You didn't have that luxury in the A6. You've already said it wasn't a supersonic aeroplane.
Yeah.
So what was your escape profile, and how vulnerable to small arms fire were you at the point at which you dropped your bombs and now you were looking to egress?
Well, the egress was, put maximum G factor on the airplane, get out of the target area, because that's where all the flak was. And then, frankly, we in the daytime, we were reluctant to go below about 3,500 feet. It depended on the area, depended on the active SAMs in the area and that sort of thing. If you had to, you could get down at a couple hundred feet and blow out of there. And frankly, we weren't too worried about small arms fire at the speed. We could get 500 knots out of the airplane with no ordnance on it if it was slick. So we didn't have afterburner, but we could get out of there pretty fast and at the appropriate altitude for the threat within the area. So the egress, I don't remember in my air wing, I don't remember an airplane ever being hit or engaged by MiGs or SAMs or anything on egress from the target, because everything was so chaotic at the target, and all of the assets of the North Vietnamese are being pointed at that small epicenter, that the airplanes flying in different directions headed for the Gulf of Tonkin weren't a threat anymore, and they were kind of hard to get at because they were all going so fast in different directions and that sort of thing. So that was our defense, was get a little bit like those guys. We'd head for the beach as fast as we could. Just couldn't go in afterburner at 600 knots. Yeah.
You mentioned that the Alpha Strike had some Shrike shooters. Were they A7s? Who were your Shrike shooters?
Well, the A-6 could shoot them too, but they would normally A-7s.
Okay.
Yeah, and they would just pop the a timing thing just before the strike group got in the vulnerable zone for the SAMs in the target area. They'd loft them into the target area so that if a radar came up, it was in danger of being homed in on by a Shrike. So that was all they could do.
Was it effective in your experience?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say. They still turned on a lot of radars, still shot a lot of SAMs, but a lot of them, I have to say, in the target area, it seems to me, most of the SAMs were just shot visually into the cluster of airplanes. Not necessarily targeted one airplane, not necessarily locked onto one airplane, but just hoping that it would get between a couple. He passed away now, but I had a good friend who was shot down in an Alpha Strike in the roll-in by a SAM that went between him and his wingman.
Wow.
And got him, not the wingman. But it was ballistic, and they kind of didn't know it was coming. So that's the thing about a SAM. You really had to know it was coming to evade it properly. You wouldn't want to defend on your RHAW gear, electronic countermeasures. So the Shrike, it was better than not having the Shrike, in my opinion. If it led to one of the sites either turning off, shutting down, whatever, and having a missile go ballistic that was going to be targeted at me, that was great. But we never really had much data on how they worked.
Really, that's very interesting, because that was going to be the next question I asked you around that was how much intelligence you had. You talked about hours and hours of intelligence study in the work up and on the way to the theater, and you mentioned Russian ships and Russian aircraft, and I wondered whether or not you were really on top of the intel around the North Vietnamese air defenses, the SAM systems, the cat and mouse game that was being played between SAM operators and then the Air Force developing its Wild Weasel program. And of course, we had Iron Hand with the Navy. I think Iron Hand was a Navy mission. But
that's what we called that's what we called both the Shrike and the Standard Arm missions. We call them Iron Hand. So
okay,
both were Iron Hand.
But you felt like you didn't really know what the sort of SAM operators' tactics or techniques or procedures were.
Well, we in an Alpha Strike, I think their technique was things were so chaotic and happening so fast, and maybe perhaps because of the Shrikes, they didn't, once the attack started, they didn't necessarily single airplanes. I think their tactic was just to shoot a bunch of SAMs into the cluster of airplanes. With Standard Arm, when we got Standard Arm, you could tell when they shut down. Because they'd be up with a high warble tracking somebody, and then the Standard Arm would go off, and the sight would go off, and probably before the Standard Arm had time to get there. So now it had a memory. Did it get the SAM site or not? We probably had that intel, but I didn't. As an aircrew member, I didn't concern myself with it on a mission-by-mission basis. I didn't come back and say, ask the intel guys if we got any of the SAM sites with the Standard Arm guys might, but I didn't come back and say, do we have any intel on whether we got a SAM site with a Shrike or a Standard Arm or whatever? My focus was on what are active SAM sites that we know haven't been destroyed when I was planning the next mission. So they did play a cat and mouse game with our Standard Arm birds. We'd send just like the Wild Weasels, we send our Standard Arm birds in there and loiter around. And, are they going to shoot at them? Are they not? If they draw a SAM, if it's going to be effective, if they don't want to just waste it, they're going to have to leave it on. They're going to have to turn it into high PRF. And then they're, how long do they leave it on with the Standard Arm coming at them? that was a real cat and mouse game.
Yeah.
I wasn't checked out in the A-6B, so I didn't do any standard arm missions. We had 3 airplanes and 6 crews that were checked out in the standard arm, and I just didn't happen to be checked out.
Can you briefly describe that then? Because there were the B and the C, weren't there? You talked about so you're flying A6A. The B and the C
A6A,
were effectively special variants. Is that a fair?
Yes, it was
way
a
of
special
describing
variant. It could still run a bombing mission. I've flown bombing missions in the A6B, but it had special gear in there where you could talk to and target and whatever the standard arm. I just wasn't. We only had a certain number of crews that were qualified to do that and stay current in that. So, yeah. But
tell us then a bit more about the other missions that you were flying in the A model.
Well, in my first cruise was primarily South Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Okay. So
South Vietnam, we either did daytime missions that were you'd work with a forward air controller, airborne forward air controller, and you'd contact him. He'd bring you into a target area and he'd describe the target area to you. Once you got it, you drop a couple of bombs and he'd say, "Yeah, those are good," or "Move them this way or that way." And he usually put a smoke in there, and then you drop your load on his smoke, and then he'd give you bomb damage assessment with another pass over the target. Either that or we did some close air support with troops in combat, which are, my opinion, are the scariest missions in the world when you're dropping bombs in close proximity to the U.S. troops. I mean, you talk about adrenaline and worry about doing it right. Those are the most, if you want to call it, exciting missions I've ever flown. Because you're in the end, you are, before you drop on those guys, you're talking to the guy on the ground with the radio who's in contact with the enemy. You're not talking to a FAC, and he's telling you, in a high-pitched voice, yelling into the radio, "Yeah, you got them," or "They're running," or "Great hits, they're running, move them north a click," that sort of thing. And it's as exciting and adrenaline filled as it gets when you're talking to that guy. Yeah. So we do some of those. And occasionally when the weather was terrible, we'd do what's called an arc light, and we'd get on the wing of an F4 or somebody that had special gear, and we'd ready hack, and we'd all drop our bombs through the clouds on his hack. We never knew where they were going, what we're dropping on, or what the results were. Those we didn't do very many of those, but we did a few of them.
Dan, can you talk a bit about working with the FACs and or the guys on the ground, the troops in contact situations, with regards to the mechanics of employing the aeroplane to do that? So, did the pilot have an optical sight or some description, or how did you target those bombs? Because the radar's not seeing smoke. So are you in the BM position able to assist in the process of prosecuting the attack? How are you working as a crew?
Yeah. Either the guy on the ground can have a beacon where he can show you his position and you can see it on the radar, or you could. Normally in Vietnam, it was strictly visual. So my part of the piece of the pie was getting us into the target area as described by the FAC. And then once we had designated basically the target area, then we were talking to the FAC. Sometimes we'd be on 2 radios, one radio talking to the FAC, one talking to the ABCCC or wherever was running the whole picture. But then it became a visual game then, and the BN could help the pilot find the target visually on the ground. And then we'd drop the bombs visually as if it were in a 45-degree dive or 30-degree dive, mostly 45, on whatever target the FAC had initiated, and drop it on his smoke, and the pilot seeing it through the gun sight.
Okay. And my limited understanding of how this works comes mainly from reading books about Air Force pilots, typically in Vietnam, flying F-105s, but you're having to be very precise on the numbers in terms of the pitch attitude, airspeed, altitude. Otherwise, if any of those 3 things go out, the bombs fall long or short or whatever. Are you in the BN position assisting with that? Are you actually keeping quiet? How do you?
Oh,
you talked
absolutely.
talked
There's
stealing coups.
dialogue going on all the time,
Okay.
and once it depends on who you're flying with. This is where you can help them get into the right position to get a 45-degree dive or not. That happened occasionally with young guys. Usually, the pilot you're flying with was well accustomed to where he needed to be at what altitude. Usually, was around 20,000 feet in relation to the target, so that he could, when he rolled over, he would be in a 45-degree dive. And then, since he's looking out and he's looking through his gun sight, watching the pipper move up toward the target and that sort of thing, then you're assisting with airspeed, giving him the airspeed and the dive angle, so that he can, pickle with the pipper long or short of the target, or right or left for that matter, so that he it's all a mental game for the pilot. It's very difficult, so he can compensate for the fact, well, I'm shallow, so I got to drop early, or I'm steep, I got to drop late, whatever, so it's all a mental game with him, but if you can help him get on airspeed and altitude, all that enhances his ability to when the pipper hits the target, for him to pickle the bombs.
So if it's not a strange question, then were you effective as a community in that mission in prosecuting those attacks?
Oh yeah, the A-6 was a great visual bomber. Yeah. I mean, it was as good as any other plane that I know of. It was a very stable platform, had a good gun sight. It was a good visual dive bomber. Yeah.
Did you? So we'll talk about your other combat tours then, but before we, where I'm guessing then, you ended up doing the Route Pack 6 stuff, and anybody listening to this will know that the Route Pack 6 stuff was the truly frightening stuff. Not to denigrate the people who worked in the South, but that was the stuff that in the Air Force they called them counters. You had to do 100 missions. Did you, while you were on your first tour then, and you were working mostly in the South, were you in a position where you had a chance to reflect on what you were doing and feel fear? Did you get scared? What was the emotional impact on you of doing that job? And how did you
the South wasn't terribly scary in that regard. There was little to no missile threat until they got shoulder fires, and then even then the flares were pretty effective against them, as long as you saw the thing, and the FAC would help you with that, obviously. So that was another thing that BN was constantly doing, was looking out for missiles while in the dive, and while the pilot was concentrating on finding the target visually and getting his roll in point and that sort of thing. And then you went. There wasn't a lot of flak down there in the South, and so you went. As soon as you got pulled out of the dive, you put a lot of G on the airplane and went back to altitude again. So once you got above about 10,000 feet, above 3,500 feet, the small arms weren't an issue. We tried to stay above 3,500 feet and drop. We tried to drop at about 3,500 feet, so you could roll out at or below 3,000, which we kind of figured was the limit of small arms. So then you just had to look out for shoulder-fired missiles and whatever AAA was down there, which wasn't much. So it was a low-threat area for that in that regard. And so the fear factor of kind of being shot down was not near as great as it might have been in Laos, because there was a lot of flak in Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Not many SAMs, but a lot of flak. And the problem with Laos was that being shot down in South Vietnam wasn't a particular worry. I mean, the chances of landing someplace and getting back to U.S. troops, you felt like was pretty good. And you always had a brief on that from the FAC just before you rolled in, where the nearest friendlies were and that sort of thing. In Laos, there weren't any friendlies, and the Pathet Lao were notorious for being pretty cruel to pilots and PMs that jacked out of airplanes and were captured there. So for me, it was scarier in Laos as far as being shot down and taken prisoner than it was in North Vietnam, because I knew at least I was going to be taken to a prison in North Vietnam, and maybe I tortured but not killed and skinned or whatever they were going to do to you. The path that law was going to do to you. So, the fear factor, if you want to call it that, from being captured went to me was very high in Laos, and there was more AAA there, and then we had to deal with the Ho Chi Minh Trail was not flat, and so you're running down valleys and that sort of thing. So the BN had to be very good at navigation, radar navigation through valleys and that sort of thing, so you didn't run yourselves into a mountaintop. So there was a lot of work going on there, and then when you found any movers, again, pilot couldn't see them, so it was a matter of the BN to drop the bombs, find the target, lock them up, and drop bombs on them. So it was a busy flight, and sometimes a lot of flak, not all the time, but scary from the standpoint of avoiding the ground and not getting captured. I do have two very good friends who were shot down in Laos cruise before I got there. They spent the night and then got picked up the next day. Really interesting story. But they weren't found by the bad guys and got picked up the next day. So then the fear factor again, this is all personal. I don't know. Sometimes I don't know what other guys were thinking, to be honest with you. We didn't necessarily talk about that. I'm more afraid on this mission than this one. Wasn't something we discussed. But in the north, I was more concerned about getting shot down, not necessarily by SAMs, but by AAA, because there was so much of it. A huge percentage of our losses in North Vietnam were due to AAA, not SAMs. So, and they put up sometimes they put up so much AAA, we'd fly through it, and you would, thinking back on it, you wouldn't believe you could fly through that without being hit by one of their shells. In that the tracers were only 1 out of 5. You'd see all these tracers coming at that, and you'd think, wow, between every one of those, there's 4 other bullets, and you'd go through that thinking, no way we flew through that without getting hit. So the pucker factor, I'll call it, it's not fear as much as pucker factor went up in North Vietnam, but the fear of being captured and killed went down. If that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So it's different missions, different areas, different enemy, different pucker factors. So
did the fact that I think I'm correct in saying that the war in Laos at that time was still classified. The U.S. administration was saying no, we're not doing anything there. Did that weigh on your mind? Was that
as I recall, you have to check me on this, but as I recall, we had admitted that we were running the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos because we figured it fair game, because that's where North Vietnam, Laos, if you don't want us to be doing this and cut off this traffic, was that kind of thing. Cambodia was the place. Cambodia. Yeah. Well, I never flew any missions in Cambodia, so okay. Honestly, I don't. We didn't worry about the legitimacy of the mission. We honestly felt like if we were being ordered to do it, it was legitimate from a government standpoint. Mm-hmm. That was how we looked at it. Laos didn't bother us, whether some people said we were engaging in illegal warfare in Laos, because, we saw what was happening there, and the government told us this is your mission, and so we felt like that was a lawful order to go in and do that. So, sorry, it's my Vietnam buddy again. It didn't really, legitimacy of our missions really didn't affect us. We knew we were doing our nation's bidding, and we were trying to do it the best we can. And, and we did try and minimize collateral damage. So that's all we could do.
On that note, one of the things, again, because I'm so Air Force centric, I apologize, but that's my frame of reference for all this
Yeah.
stuff. The books that I've read about the Air Force guys out there doing the fast jet tactical aviation in that theater is the interference by the political masters in the targeting process, and maybe even down to the selection of weapons and perhaps even fusing. I don't know if they really got that granular, but they were saying
I don't believe they did. Yeah.
what did you see then as a being in the A-6 in terms of the way that target sets were assigned to you, and you were then allowed or not allowed to plan the execution of those missions?
Well, we could see with our own eyes on Alpha Strike, you could say lucrative targets that, rail yards or whatever that they wouldn't let us hit. And that really made us angry, very angry. And we knew that that was a political decision, and it made us angry. So we didn't appreciate that. We didn't think the war was being run properly. And I mean, I freely admit, I didn't like some of the stuff we did because I think we could do it better, more effectively. But on the other hand, you just do your duty. You do what you're told, because it's chaos if you don't. It's interesting that Steve Kuntz's book is all about straying from doing what you're told on the more lucrative targets that are there and are going to come after you. So it did make us mad, and we knew that there was political falderall going on, but you just have to either do what you're supposed to do. You either do your duty or you don't, and you turn in your wings and go home. I mean, that was the way I looked at it. If I wasn't going to do my duty, then I needed to turn my wings in and go home. So, but yeah, it pissed me off.
What about tactics? And I've asked a couple of times about tactics, and I asked the question around the Alpha Strike not playing or playing or not playing to the strengths of the airplane. You said it didn't play to the strengths of the airplane at all. Are you, as you go through this and you become a more experienced aviator, are you looking at the tactics that are being directed for you to use and questioning that? I mean, I just, so for example, you talked about the football stadium full of trucks. I'm guessing that would take a long time to empty. I'm also guessing that if you flew that mission at night, you could do a laydown of your 22 500-pound bombs across the length and breadth of that stadium and probably achieve the same kind of effects, assuming that everyone dropping from the big package is not going to actually hit the target. So are you looking at that kind of thing and thinking, well, I wish we could do it differently, or why don't we just do a night attack or whatever?
We often said, if we could just exactly that, if we could just attack this at night with a couple of airplanes, we could achieve the same or better results.
How does that manifest itself then? Are you able to say that to somebody in the air wing, to an admiral?
Well, you could say to your squadron CO, then all he can do is talk to CAG about it, the air wing commander about it. Of course, he's not in charge of authorizing targets either. So it's a, you'd have to go to 7th Fleet to authorize some of this stuff. And some of it, I don't know, but some of it I think they did in the daytime to make sure they minimized collateral damage and make sure an airplane did drop a bunch of bombs off target because they had the wrong target at night. I really don't know. But we didn't have much say, or didn't think we did anyway, in terms of, why don't we do it this way? So
did you look at
and nobody, as I recall, we did all our own weaponeering. They gave us the target, and we said, okay, we'd say to the squadron CO, this is what Steve and I think we should drop on this thing. And here's the fuses, electrical or mechanical delay, whatever. We do the weaponeering, and he or the XO and the tactical officer would, and maybe the ops officer would look at it and say, yeah, they make sense. But what McNamara wasn't telling us, to use electrical fuses or whatever. So, and well, like in terms of SAM sites, we'd go after SAM sites And we kind of decided, look, the way to go after these things is with Rockeye. So we put, 18 or 20 or 22 Rockeye on the airplane to go after, because he'd cover a big area, and those little fragment bombs could do a lot of damage to a radar site. You didn't have to blow up the radar van in order to disable it, obviously, or the antennae for that reason, for that matter. So, it made infinite sense to drop Rockeye on these things. Sometimes, though, that it was limited by, we're running a little low on Rockeye, so we're going to use Mark 82s anyway. Some of it's dictated by that sort of thing. You didn't necessarily at any given time have an infinite source of what you needed. Although we were constantly getting resupplied with stuff, we never really, I don't never recall having a shortage of weapons where when we said, Skipper, this is what we think we need to drop, where he said, no, we don't have enough. So.
Did you ever drop 22 Rockeye from your airplane?
Yeah, on the SAM sites, sure.
So what did that look like? Did you roll wings down and have a look and see?
The first time I did it, it was pretty scary because the ground lights up and it looks like it's a bunch of AAA, a bunch of AAA sites firing at you. Till you realize, oh wait, those were the Rockeye. The first time, it's just one of those never seen before. Oh, so that okay, I got that imprinted in my mind now. But we would, when we brought the POWs out, we were flying SAM suppression missions before the B-52s came in, and so we'd take as many A-6s as we could get airborne off as many carriers and go after SAM sites. And so we'd all have 22 Rockeye. Either we drop all of them on one, or which we did on occasion, or half of them on one and half of them on another. So I had the opportunity to drop all of them.
Did you say, Stan, that was the POW mission?
The which?
Did you say that was that
when Nixon said, okay, I should have said when we brought the POWs out, when we decided we were going to make the North Vietnamese give up in December of 72 for Linebacker 2. When Nixon said, he said, okay, here you go, boys, have at it. And then we got some sweet targets.
Yeah.
And then in conjunction with the B-52s, we were doing, instead of going on those night missions, we were going after, on the night missions, in conjunction with the B-52s, we went after SAM sites just before they came in. We also flew our own night missions when the B-52s weren't on the airplane. But on those missions, we flew 22 Rockeye against SAM sites.
Wow.
To try and keep their heads down. But in spite of that, I will never see anything in my life as like the number of SAMs I shot at the B-52s.
Really?
It still boggles my mind to have seen that. But it was just amazing, the number of SAMs I shot at those guys.
What did it look like then? Can you describe it?
Well, they just look like fireballs. All you can see is the trail, the fire trail. That's all you can see when one's shooting at you. Either you can't see the SAM because it's nighttime. You just see the fireball. And then the only reason you know it's a SAM, it's a SAM. But the only thing you can see of the SAM is a black dot in the middle of the fireball.
Wow. And
that's you got no depth perception. When you have a SAM shot at you at night, if it's coming at you, you just see this black dot in the middle of the fireball. And in the daytime, you have depth perception. You know how close the SAM's getting, so you know when to make your evasive turn. At night, it's all based on how bright the fireball is before you turn. It's not exactly an exact science, because you don't want to turn too early, or the SAM will just track you in the turn, and you don't want to turn late, or the SAM will blow up next to you.
Mm-hmm. So
you got to turn. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with SAM evasion tactics that we were using at the time. We would put the SAM. So here comes the SAM. So you put the SAM in the clock code of between 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. And then somewhere in that, well, at the 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock position, one of those positions on either side. And then when you determine that you are going to make your move, you turn through the nose of the SAM. And hopefully you've turned so that the SAM with those little tiny fins can't turn as fast as you can, and it's going to whiz on by you on the other side. If you turn too early, it'll just turn right with you. So, if you turn too late, it's got you. So it's a matter of, in the daytime, you see it at depth perception. You say, okay, I know how close it is. I know it's time to turn now. And so you turn right through the nose of it, and it hopefully it goes by underneath. That's the tactic, and it works great. At night, all you got is that black dot. So you're just working on how bright it is. And it's our skipper used to say, well, you got to wait till it's about so bright that you can kind of read your kneeboard cards in the cockpit. Oh, okay. Well, is that when you turn, skipper? And you go, well, no, you got to wait a little longer. Well, is that when you turn? He says, no, then you count a couple of potatoes. And is that when you turn? He says, yeah, that's when you turn. It's one of those things. He was an old hand. I mean, he'd been on, this was his 4th cruise. So to us, guy, with eyes this big, trying to figure that out but you can do it. I mean, it's not rocket science, but we didn't lose any airplanes to SAMs, fortunately, at night. So most of them weren't tracking us down as low as we got, was the real reason.
Do you remember how many, or approximately how many SAMs you got shot at you? I mean, how comfortable is probably not the right word, but yeah. But how comfortable did you get being shot at SAMs, knowing you could gauge those distances at night and in the daytime?
I can't tell you exact number, but it was enough to know that. Different things. At night, I can only remember maybe one SAM actually tracking on us because we were down below their ability to track. They'd shoot them at us, and you could tell if the SAM was tracking at you because it would be, constant range, constant bearing, decreasing range. If the SAM CRBD, it's tracking on you, and now you got to turn in and put at 10 or 2 o'clock and make your evasive movement. If it's not, you just watch it kind of go its own way and know that it's, that it's not going to, because it's ballistic and it's not going to be a real threat to you. They were just trying to scare you into flying into the ground, or hoping you wouldn't see it, or, shoot at from behind you type of thing. So it's never really something you're comfortable with, but if you can see a SAM, I mean, the general rule of thumb was if you can see a SAM, you can defeat it. If you see it too late, you can't. So, and in an alpha strike, it was interesting because on the way in, everybody would get the low warble and go, oh, there's a SAM sight up. And then it would turn into a high warble for one airplane because they were tracking him. And you just see this poor guy, you just see him just sort of move up out of the formation and go over here because it was his turn in the barrel. And everybody else would look up there and go, well, I'm glad that's not me. But, that's too bad for him. But, he'll be back in formation in a few minutes. So,
did your self-protection jammers then, you talked about the self-protection jammer you had that would do the range gate steering or whatever it was that was going to do.
Range gate pull-off. I'm trying to think of the term. Yeah.
So it's good. Did they work better in formation? Did they work well? Generally?
Well, the problem is if you pull a range gate off of one, it might jump on another one. So it worked better out of formation.
Okay. Yeah. So with regards to the night strikes then against those SAM sites, and you talked about hitting the Ho Chi Minh Trail or sort of moving targets. Can you describe how you flew those missions? I think about, I had Brad Inslee, who was an F111 guy, sadly died last year, but he was on the channel. He talked about being in the A model, using the terrain following radar to keep them from hitting the ground. And he talked about dropping snake eye from 100 feet on airfields and that kind of stuff.
Yep.
I guess late in the war, you've already said you didn't have a TF. How did you plan and execute those missions then and not hit the ground?
Well, here's the beautiful thing about the Red River Delta. It was flat. No, I'm serious. It was God's gift to the A-6. With the exception of a few karst ridges, which you could hit if you weren't paying attention, it was flat. And so, unless see the Air Force guys all came from Thailand, and they had to go through mountains to get there. So they needed terrain following radar to get through the mountains and not be vulnerable above the mountains when they got near the Hanoi area, coming in what we called the back door. It was basically the front door for them. But we came in from the Gulf of Tonkin. Okay, I did a back door into Hanoi once, but the mountains weren't terribly challenging. We weren't in very long, so it wasn't a particular issue. And I had us going down a valley that was easy to get into and easy not to hit the sides of. And as long as, if you were in a valley, as long as you could see radar return ahead of you, then you weren't going to hit anything. But as soon as there was blackness up there, you had to get up until you could see something behind that blackness, and then you knew you wouldn't hit it. So anyway, God's gift to a Bombardier Navigator and the pilot was that the Red River Valley was flat. It was a beautiful thing. The other thing was, this has to do with communication between the pilot and the Bombardier. In Whidbey Island, so the Bombardier worked in true headings in the system. The pilot primarily worked on magnetic headings and all his gear. It's an airplane cockpit. I fly airplanes, and I fly airplanes today, and it's all mag. So that when you gave the pilot a heading, you both had to be darn sure. That's part of the crew concept, that the heading you were giving him was either mag or true. So in Whidbey Island, there was a 22-degree difference between magnetic and true. Wow. So if the heading given to the pilot was misconstrued, there was a big problem. Well, you didn't have to worry about that. The other God's gift to the A-6 crew was that the variation there was basically zero. So mag and true headings were, to all intents and purposes, were the same. So you didn't have to worry about, okay, when I give you a heading off target, it's magnetic because you're going to be looking at your instruments. When I give you this going to the target, it's true because, you don't have to worry about that because they were all the same. I mean, it sounds kind of funny, but I learned early on, I said, kind of glad this place is flat and there's no variation here. It makes things a lot simpler. So if you want to fly 300 feet, it's a whole lot easier to do that with your radar altimeter humming along at 300, knowing that the terrain is flat, or even if it changes, it's going to be a gradual thing, because you're going a little bit down into the Red River Valley, maybe instead of the Red River Delta writ large, but it's all gradual. And then if you're flying straight level and if the radar altimeter starts to go down, if you will, then you need to pick up the nose a little bit to stay a little higher above the ground. So it was a beautiful thing to be able to stay at altitude without excessive worry of hitting the ground, and be underneath the radar, the SAM radars at 300 to 500 feet, so that you didn't have to make any real high G maneuvers at low altitudes, which, the altitude makes it more difficult because when you put a lot of G's on an airplane, top rudder and all that stuff to keep it from the nose falling through and everything. But you didn't have to worry about that at low altitude without the ability to track you. So it was still a scary thing being down there. But the workload, I guess you want to call it, was a little different because you just weren't worrying too much about running into things or the ground coming up at you suddenly. So those two things I always thought were a gift about the Red River Valley.
What were you've described already what you were doing, so it sounds like a stupid question to ask. What were you doing while this attack run was going on? But what I'm wondering is, were you constantly heads down in the radar scope doing your stuff, or were there periods where you were waiting for the next phase, and so therefore you were up looking outside for, I don't know, what you can see at night, AAA or whatever?
Yeah, great question. Because the rap on bombardiers is they'd stick their head in the hood and they never look out, and that wasn't true. I mean, we first of all, at night you could see everything that was going on the radar. It had a hood about this big around, and you could see the radar great in there, and you didn't have to stick your head in there because your turn points and stuff were normally radar significant things that you could see on the radar pretty easily. You didn't have to have your head in the hood, and you needed to be on the lookout for flak and SAMs and that sort of thing. So most BNs that I know of didn't have their head in the sand, stuck like an ostrich, hoping things would go right. Plus, you needed to be able to look over at the pilot, sometimes see what he was doing. So I didn't have my head in the boot until you got in the target area. Then when you got in the target area and you needed to find that target and you need to put the cursors right on it and make your last velocity correct. I talked about letting the cursors drift off the target and then putting it back on and hit velocity correct button, get the last bit of drift in there, out of there, or it wasn't quite getting the winds calculated quite right. Then you had to put your head in the hood. But by that time, you were basically, you turned yourself over to the gods of war, and the pilot was flying straight and level at whatever your attack altitude was, and you were just hoping for the best. So looking out wasn't necessarily something you needed to do, and you needed to have your head in there to get the most precise cursor placement. So it was a combination. Interestingly enough, about having your head in the hood, I flew quite a few alpha strikes with the wing commander. Great guy. Turned out to be Admiral Joe Frick. He was Commander Joe Frick at the time. Joe was an experienced A-6 pilot. But as a lead navigator of a 24 airplane strike, and you're going in there at 20,000 feet, I kind of felt like it was my duty to get the strike to the target. That's what I was there for. So, and it's bright daylight, so I had to put my head in there a lot of the time to see my turn point or wherever it was. And as soon as I do that, Joe would say, "Hey, get your head out of there. God, wait, you need to be looking, your head needs to be on a swivel. You need to be, I'd say, the first time this happened, Rank goes out the window in the cockpit. And when he's, I said, I won't swear, but I said, "Daggone it, Keg, I got to get us the freaking target, and I got to stick my head in there to do that to find it on the radar. Leave me alone." And there's 20 other guys out here that are looking for SAMs, So I thought probably after that he wouldn't want to fly with me anymore. I told the schedule, I said, "Keg's probably not going to fly with me anymore." Sure enough, a couple of days later, the schedule was, so he didn't mind. He it was all a dialogue. So, but anyway, in the daytime, you did have to put your head in there to find the target.
Yeah.
And so, but you didn't have to keep it in there. You'd find your turn point, just like at night. You find your turn point, so you find your turn point, bring your head out. And again, there were 16 or 18 other airplanes looking out for SAMs and AAA and everything. So,
what indications then, what cue or steering cues did the pilot get from your designation of the target then? How did they know where to fly and at what point to drop the bombs? Was there any automation in there?
Yeah, he had a vertical display in front of him, a TV tube about probably 10 inches across, 8 inches high, maybe not quite that big, but it was basically a vertical indicator. So it had a horizon and it had little play clouds at the top, and then there was a computer generated ground at the bottom, and then in the middle of that, if you will, was we called it the yellow brick road. It was like a highway, and it went like this from the bottom of the scope to where the, cursors were. And so if you cycled to the next turn point and it was a right turn, the highway and the highway would cycle to the right. And then he would put in a turn, and then that square would go over there to the computer's calculated proper turn for that to get to that turn point. And then when he got there, you'd bring that steering dot back to the middle, and the highway would be pointed right at it. So he knew he was on the yellow brick road to the next turn point or the target. So it was a computer generated, but it all made sense. Oh, there goes the highway. I guess the next turn point's over there. So you turn, and it would, the turning point would go over to, and then you'd start bringing it back to the middle. And when you got to the middle, everything was copacetic. It was an interesting way to give him a big visual cue of what the computer was doing right in front of him.
Was release automated then of the weapons or the bombs?
Well, it was. He had, on the stick, he had a commit switch that had to, whether he was dropping the bombs or whether the system was going to drop them, he had to agree that with me that we had the target. Basically, the agreement was, I got the target. But if he had anything, if there was anything in his peripheral vision, anything where he disagreed with it, he'd say no. And if he didn't pull on the commit switch, then you couldn't step the computer into attack, which meant that now it went from the navigation mode into the attack mode. And so he had to commit, but then it was all dropped by virtue of where I had the computer cursors and where the system thought he had to drop the bombs. Yeah, and when he dropped visually in a 45-degree dive, he'd pull the commit switch, and then he'd hit the pickle on top of the stick. But he didn't need to do that in the system drop.
Okay. One thing that I've been thinking about a couple of times while you've been talking around the threat reactions around flying at night, you looking out, having a role to play in not just sort of being sort of sucked into the scope, is the side-by-side seating arrangement. I suppose when I look at the A-6, it looks like it's got this huge bubble canopy. It looks like you must have amazing visibility. But does the fact that you are sitting on the right-hand side of the pilot, I know he's elevated a little bit more.
A little bit, a couple inches, yeah.
Do you obstruct his vision?
Yeah. It all worked out great. I mean, we both had our sides of the airplane. He, for the most part, he didn't, unless we were making a right-hand roll in, he didn't really need to see much out that side of the canopy. I don't recall it ever having been an issue. It was kind of like, well, he had his side and I had mine, and we both, like when you take the runway, you want to make sure you want to be clear of airplanes. They're not going to land on top of you. So he could necessarily see over there that well, so it was his job to say, clear on the right. It was that sort of crew coordination, which for the most part obviated his need to see much out of that side of the canopy. But the seat sitting side by side was the greatest gift to crew coordination that was ever created. You could literally, if you wanted to, like if you were trying to find the target visually with a FAC, and I could find the target on a chart, I could put the chart right between us and go, there it is in that river, that the whatever the FAC called that point of reference. Oh, okay, I got it. And then he'd look out there and say, okay, I got that. You could communicate if you lost internal communications. You could write notes to each other. You could, you could slap each other on the back if you had a good hit. The communication, you could communicate just by looking over on. There were things you did. You wanted to make sure the pilot did, whatever they might be. Like when the time came to dump fuel, usually he would say, the fuel dump is on. But you knew it was time, and you saw him reach down there, and you knew he was turning the fuel dump on. So I'd always say, Roger, the fuel dump. He didn't even have to say that. There were just intuitive things that happened, especially between a crew that had been together for a long time, that were just fantastic. Not to mention, you knew each other's language and idiosyncrasies and likes and dislikes, I guess, for that matter, about how to do things, how to approach problems. It was a dream crew concept airplane. Absolutely. I've got time in the F4, a little bit in the F4, but a lot of time in the F-14. And crew concept is much more difficult because you can't see each other. And if you lose ICS in an F-14, forget about it. You can still run your weapon system and everything, but the communication is done. It's almost non-existent. So that side-by-side seating was fantastic. It was the greatest thing about the airplane. And it was only enabled by the fact that you had to have that big bulbous nose out there. Otherwise, they'd have probably made it a tandem airplane. So I have to give radar credit for that.
On that note, you talked about multiple combat cruises then. You flew with Steve Coots, and if he's listening to this, by the way, thank you for writing Flight of the Intruder, because that is just that is the book of my childhood. So if you
and it finally talked about attack airplanes instead of fighters. Yeah.
But when you went on other cruises, and so you had been hard crewed with Stephen Coots to begin with, on your second and subsequent combat tours, is it then the opposite of that initially, where actually now you kind of have to unlearn some of the intuition? That's a contradiction in terms. You can't unlearn intuition. Intuition is intuition. But do you know what I mean? You kind of
it was just like fun. I mean, occasionally flew with another guy in the A-6 squadron, and it just things just get a little more formal. There are just formalities of crew concept that everybody's supposed to abide by, and so you just fall back to those. You always say this if you move this switch. You always do this. You always do that. Things that you drift away from or morph out of your own crew, go right back to the basics and crew concept, so you don't forget anything. So you just morph back to the basics of crew concept, and then you relearn to fly with another guy. My second cruise, I flew with one of my classmates from the Naval Academy, and we sort of had to do that. He was a nugget, and I was a combat experienced lieutenant, and so we just, I was trying to teach him everything about the boat that he could possibly want to know, and we were trying to learn what our ultimate cruise concept was going to be, past just what you learned in VA 128. I guess that's, you fall back to what you learned in VA 128 because you were always flying with a different person there. And cruise concept was very cut and dried. You always do this, you always do that. You never do this, you never do that. So, but that merges and morphs when you get to fly with a guy all the time.
Stan, I'm beginning to run out of time.
Okay.
Not to live.
No, I hope not.
Hopefully we'll be able to come back and do a part two, but just generally.
Do part two on whatever you want, carriers or the ultimate evolution of the A6.
Well, we could do that. We could finish.
I'd love to talk about how we've talked about the A6 as I knew it as a lieutenant. Boy, the A6 I knew as a commander and an admiral and a captain were unbelievable. The capabilities with the forward-looking infrared radar and laser-guided bombs, and it was a.
That's what we can do. We can come back and record part two. We can finish off the A6 story in inverted commas, and then go back and then go to look at your nuclear. What did you call it? Nuclear surface vessel training or nuclear propulsion?
Oh well, we call it nuclear power training.
Nuclear power training. Okay, so we could go to that and then find out how you drive an aircraft carrier. I'm joking. I know that's not what you did, but that's very interesting to me.
Kind of. I mean, I did a couple times. I had to take the helm a couple times.
Yeah. Okay. We'll talk about
Captain's
that.
got the con, and everybody gets relieved because if something's going to happen, something bad's going to happen, the captain's got the con, and nobody else will go down for it. We do call it driving the aircraft.
Okay.
Or driving the ship. So.
And I want to know what the turn circle is on it as well.
Or the boat is what
the boat. But before we end today,
Yeah.
then I haven't really asked you about specific missions that stand out in your mind, and I guess it's cliche to say, tell me about your first combat mission. And for some people, their first mission was anticlimactic and it wasn't particularly memorable. But perhaps the question I should really ask you is, do you, or which missions stand out in your mind, in your memory? And if I'm, if we're trying to get deep and meaningful about it, and I'm genuinely curious about this, are there ones that you dream about? Are there ones that you, as though they happened yesterday?
Yeah, there are a couple. One, you talked about dropping on an airfield, and at 100 feet, we dropped on my second cruise. We dropped 16 or 18. Can't remember now, snake eyes on an airfield, and got a great hit. I found the airfield, and it in those days it was a little difficult to interpret the ground from the runway. And anyway, we had visual laydown in his gun sight, and so I got him going right down the runway, and he laid him down on the runway, and it was perfect crew coordination, and we came back and saw the hits on that, and they were perfect. They were beautiful.
Wow.
I'll always remember that one. Yeah.
This was at night?
Yeah. It was a nice night. Unfortunately, so they could see us a little bit. We had several SAMs shot at us, and we got a DFC for that because of the SAMs, I guess, probably. Although we clocked the runway pretty good, but that's a particularly memorable one. And then there's a couple down in Laos where we got some significant secondaries on trucks on AMTI that worked perfectly, and because a lot of those were, you drop your bombs and not know whether they did anything, and so and then one particular close air support mission in South Vietnam where the Marine FAC was yelling how great the hits were, and the guys were running, and it just fills you up. So yeah, there were a few of those.
Do you ever get to meet any of those guys? Did you hear?
No,
about
I've never met a FAC. Well, I did quickly. I did about 10 days as a exchange guy over with the Naval FACs on a NOCOM Phenom. So I did meet some FACs. I never did actually talk to one that I knew. I flew with a couple missions with him on a NOCOM Phenom on an exchange thing, which was great. Because we could look at the sensors on the trail and all that stuff that we only heard about. So
a question I've asked before, not many times, but I'd like to ask you it now. But it might sound like a strange question, and perhaps it is, but does it feel like, because it was a long time ago, does it feel like it happened, it was a different person, that was an experience that happened to a Stan that's different? I mean, does it feel like it's your experience? Is it so distant?
Well, it's funny you said, because I am a different person. I mean, I grew up, I grew in so many ways from being a young lieutenant. But to answer your question, I think is what you mean. Sometimes I look at those missions and can't believe that we actually did them. I mean, I look at the complexity of them and the fact that we were just kids, and they give us these multi-billion-dollar airplanes and all these bombs and tell us to go bomb a factory or something. I mean, it's surreal. Sometimes it's surreal thinking back on it. It really is. And then, like I say, to think about flying through all that flak and coming out the other end without being shot down is surreal. So there's a surreal aspect to it, actually. Yeah.
Do you have to have lots of photographs from that time?
I don't have very many. I've got a cruise movie I could send it to you just for grins if you want to look at it. That was put together by the guy that was calling me on the phone, as a matter of fact.
Probably calling you say, don't give it to that English guy.
Yeah. But no, I don't. I have a few photographs, but it's funny. In those days, we were more interested in taking pictures of the ship and the airplane and all this other stuff. And what we really want now is the pictures of us.
Yeah.
And there aren't very many of those. He's been pretty good at finding either 8mm rolled pictures of us and putting them in slideshows, you know.
Yeah.
But in those days, you're just worried about the bravado of it and the, you know, look at me flying from an aircraft carrier, look what I'm doing. Not look at my friends, you know, look at my squadron mates, my brothers.
You still doing
That's what we
reunions?
concentrate on.
Are you still doing reunions? Do you still do this?
We did, you know, last June, no, 18 months ago now, we did a reunion of the squadron, just the squadron, people that were in the squadron on the 72 cruise, 72, 73 cruise, where we did Linebacker 2 and made the North Vietnamese give up. And those are our best, scariest, most fun missions with the B-52s and everything. And so we had a reunion in Whidbey Island, and it was, you know, seeing those guys after 50 years, they were all the same. You know, we just went right into kidding each other about the same stupid stuff, you know, laughing and scratching about things that didn't matter, and you know, giving each other grief and calling each other by our nicknames. And it was amazing. There wasn't one political word spoken. Nobody cared. You know, wasn't what it was all about. We were just brothers, and it was pretty amazing. There were like 27 of us there of the 45 or so that were in the squadron. It was incredible. And I get together every 2 years with 5 other guys that were in the squadron, and that one of them was calling. Unfortunately, we're all going to the funeral of one of them, one of us, at the end of the month. And he's calling about that, I'm sure. Cancer. So, but yeah, sometimes I look back on it, and it's hard to believe that we did all that stuff.